Imagine a world without neon lights, electric heaters, or the suspicious hum of a refrigerator rummaging through its dreams at 3 a.m. Now dim everything. Picture a single candle glowing in a log and daub cabin, its timid flame doing its best to hold back a sea of darkness. Welcome to winter in colonial New England, where snow didn't just mean sleigh bells. It meant near total silence, except for the occasional owl who apparently missed the memo on hibernation etiquette. In the 17th and 18th centuries, early European settlers in America faced winters not with turtlenecks and Nordic-themed mugs, but with stoicism, bear grease, and a level of patience that could thaw soup just by waiting long enough. Life moved slowly. It had to. The snow wasn't something you shoveled so much as something you respected, like a quiet guest who arrived in November and overstayed until April. Outside, snow dampened every noise. No wheel carts clattering on cobblestone, no chickens griping about the cold. Just a soft, muffled seeming of the world, as though winter had thrown a woolen hat over nature's ears. Inside, life shrank to small gestures. Stirring soup, mending socks, and pretending you didn't hear Aunt Mildred telling that one story about the fox and the butter churn. Again, time wasn't just slowed, it was steeped. Food, for example, was treated less as something flavorful and more as a commitment. The primary winter dish, porridge, and not the kind with brown sugar and a culinary degree. We're talking thick, glutinous bowls of cornmeal mush or oat soup that could double as wallpaper paste, depending on your seasoning choices. Every household had a pot perpetually simmering on the hearth, sometimes for days. A communal bubbling cauldron of everything we have until the snow clears. People didn't so much eat dinner as they orbited it. The pot was always there, waiting, steaming, omnipresent. Occasionally someone would claim it tasted better the second or third day. This was a desperate optimism often greeted with silence and more chewing. Sleep became a winter sport of its own. Without street lamps, blue light, or podcasts gently whispering about productivity hacks, people generally slept in two stretches, the first sleep and the second sleep, with a strange window of wakefulness in between. What did they do during this weird midnight pause? Oh, all sorts of things, according to diaries and letters, stoking the fire, praying, visiting neighbors. Yes, in the middle of the night, reading by firelight, or simply lying awake and waiting for dreams to return. Outside, the snow piled in solemn drifts, content to press its fingers against the world and hush it. It whispered secrets through the chinks in the cabin walls and sighed along the roof beams, its presence as firm and inescapable as family. Lighting, one of those privileges we take blissfully for granted, was a full-blown pursuit in these early days. Candles had to be made by hand, usually from tallow, rendered beef fat. The smell alone could reduce any ambitious plans for evening productivity to, let's just sit quietly and avoid inhaling. Only the wealthier folks could afford beeswax candles, which smelled nicer and burned longer, thus unfairly boosting their chances of reading books and moods deep into the evening. Stories were passed around like heirlooms. With limited parchment and plenty of spare time, oral tradition nested deep in these wintry nights. Children would sit, eyes wide by the fireplace, as grandparents told tales of wolves with suspicious negotiating skills, haunted root cellars, or that one fool who tried to travel to the village during a blizzard and returned with frostbite and a sheep that wasn't his. In the corners of these homes, time hung heavy. Folks might mend a shoe 10 times before tossing it. There were 8 different ways to cure a sore throat, and none of them were delicious. From mustard poultices to boiled onion tea, the line between medicine and punishment was delicate at best. And yet, despite all this slowness, or perhaps because of it, there was a kind of peace, a rhythm. The world had fewer distractions, fewer dings and buzzes. Time wasn't sliced into 30-second distractions. It was a quilt of long minutes, stitched together with patience, stillness, and the gentle bubbling of ever more creative porridge recipes. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Let's gently close the shutters now, the snow still falling, quietly widening the silence outside. It began, as many curious things do, with a whistle in the wind and a biscuit gone terribly, unforgivably hard. The settlers of early North America, wrapped in wool and sheer optimism, had a unique relationship with winter. On one hand, it was a time of chilling calm, of snowflakes catching on eyelashes and hearth fires cracking like cozy thunder. On the other hand, it was also when your bread developed the texture of building material, your neighbor transformed into a walking fur coat with opinions, and the notion of entertainment involved making a spoon out of wood, very slowly. By the time December draped its white shawl across the cabins and snowbanks pressed up like curious dogs against the windows, everything had to be ready. Settlers who hadn't split enough firewood had about 3 weeks to regret their life choices. A barrel of salt pork sitting in the corner of the pantry took on mythic proportions, both as survival food and as thrilling Friday night cuisine when paired with stewed turnips and irrational hope. To pass the frigid, endless nights, families turned inward, not in some poetic, introspective sense, but quite literally. Everyone huddled like spoons in the one warm room of the cabin, often sleeping near the hearth with feet poking dangerously close to the embers. Heat was a precious guest, and doors were opened rarely and only with much ceremony, as if letting in an actual bear. Communication during these winters took a gentle turn. Voices had to be low, partially out of respect for the silence of snow-covered forests, and partially because who wants to shout with chapped lips and frozen eyebrows? Sled-drawn mail was comically rare, and news was passed like folk songs, sung roughly, somewhat inaccurate, and always with an unexpected verse involving a neighbor who lost a toe due to icicle-related misadventure. And then there were the quiet rituals that earned their place through repetition and survival. Candle making, for instance. A profoundly slow process made even slower by the sway of frozen fingers. Dipped again and again, each taper grew in patience and wax, until it could burn with sturdy pride, if not too close to the drying laundry. Quilting was a particular art of the long winter. Grandmothers wielded needles like thin daggers of encouragement. Entire stories were sewn into those squares, a bit of cloth from a brother's coat, a patch from a wedding dress, even the corner of a calendar that seemed too hopeful to throw out. A quilt wasn't just for warmth. It was a slow conversation stitched by hands with stories to spare. Of course, personal hygiene relaxed its grip somewhat during these icy months. Bathing incidents were rare and often involved negotiating with a large iron kettle, half a creek's worth of water, and 2 to 3 hours of one's life. Soap, when available, was enthusiastic but unreliable. It either smelled like a meadow in bloom or a regretful experiment involving lye and sheep tallow. Then there was the matter of snow. Not just snow, but the ever-inventive ways it complicated basic tasks. For instance, want to take out the chamber pot? Congratulations, you're now on a pre-dawn expedition across what used to be a backyard and is now an Arctic mystery with wolves. Pulling water from the well. Lovely idea. Hope you have a pickaxe and extensive patience. Walking anywhere, strap on snowshoes the size of dinner tables and waddle like a heroic duck. And still, within all this frostbitten absurdity, there was immense beauty. The stark hush that fell over the land, muffling even the birds. The moonlight that turned the whole world silver, as though the stars themselves had chosen to sleep on Earth. The laughter that erupted when someone fell into a snowdrift for the 5th time that week, and the strange comfort found in hearing a neighbor cough through the wall. A reminder that yes, the other side hadn't frozen solid just yet. These were nights of slow thinking and slower doing. Days were brief, sun-drenched yawns framed in white. Nights stretched long enough to tell stories from 5 winters ago and make up 1 or 2 just for variety. By candlelight and crackling log, people shared not just warmth, but memory. They passed mugs of spruce-tip tea, clinked wooden spoons in silence, and watched the snow fall like time itself, slow, soft, and strangely reassuring. It was in this intimate stillness that traditions took root, some practical, others delightfully pointless, like competitive mitten knitting, or the silent sport of trying not to wake the baby while transferring them from one lap to another. Outside, the snow built up quietly in crests and folds, wrapping the world in forgetfulness and whispering that everything could wait. Even hope seemed to nap a bit in winter, curling beneath the cabinets like a lazy cat, waiting, patiently, dreamily, for the thaw. And in this slow-motion season of hushes and hearths, a certain kind of resilience bloomed, not loudly, but beneath every quiet chore and muffled laugh. As another log slipped into the fire, sending up a sleepy swirl of sparks, the snow kept falling, and someone, somewhere began humming a forgotten tune, half lullaby and half map. Some maps, after all, are drawn not with ink, but with memory and mittens. And somewhere in that melody, something was already stirring for the next night's tale. Beneath the drifting snow, beneath all that hush. The early settlers weren't just battling frostbite and werewolves of the imagination, though some swore the shadows under the trees walked on their own. No, tucked within log walls and bundled under woolen layers, they were also fighting an unexpected nemesis, silence. Not the peaceful kind, like the calm before a snowfall, or the hush before a host sneezes during dinner. No, this was a deep, disorienting silence. The kind where the snow seemed to soak up all sound, as if it had signed a secret pact with the sky to hush the world below. For many, winter's silence was oppressive, a soft, blanketing void that made even the ticking of a wooden clock feel like a cannonade. Inside their roughly hewn cabins, built from trees they'd personally evicted from the land, the settlers found themselves enclosed in a bubble where noise became an artifact of summer. The howls of wolves and creaking branches outside played tricks on the imagination. If the wind blew just right, some claimed you could hear voices, perhaps the spirits of ancestors, or more likely, the neighboring Andersons cursing at their frozen cheese wheel again. By December, time had adopted an odd elasticity. Days blurred into evenings, and evenings sank into a darkness so complete that it felt like walking around with your eyes closed, even while blinking. It was during these endless nights that people began talking of winter ghosts, not spectral figures exactly, but things seen only in late cold and low lamplight. A misplaced spoon found weeks later in the ceiling rafters. Loaves of bread hollowed out without explanation. a sudden draft that seemed to sigh rather than blow through. Of course, the more rational minds chalked these up to mice, chimney drafts, and boredom seasoned liberally with isolation. But in church on Sundays, if the preacher dared mention devils, several sets of eyes flicked toward the corners of the room, where it was always just a little too dark. What's overlooked now, in our climate-controlled, candle-scented modernity, is how the settlers coped. They didn't have podcasts or slow jazz for ambiance, but they had their own version of mental insulation, stories, layered, slowly spun like warm wool scarves for the mind. A visitor in 1793 recalled sitting in a Vermont cabin, awed as a grandmother recited an oral saga that meandered like a snowshoe trail through the woods. Her voice, low and sure, filled the room with a rhythm steadier than the creaking pine logs overhead. The story was about a giant goose that laid golden eggs until it flew too close to the moon and burned its tail. It made no sense. But that wasn't the point. These stories were less about logic and more about binding things. The family, the hearth, the heart. Like latch-hooking memory into long, cold nights, so they wouldn't unravel entirely. Even small children took on the role of artists, drawing crude pictures in soot on the walls, or sculpting tiny animals from crumbs of tallow and ash. Their laughter, muffled though it was by wool and walls, disrupted the silence like sunlight cracking ice. And then there were the logs. Not just any logs, mind you. These were the fireplace's main event. Burning wood in winter was more than heating. It was entertainment. Families debated over whose log cracked the loudest, which one smelled faintly of maple, and whether the pine knot that popped like gunfire was a sign of luck or a warning. It was always Uncle Elias who believed it was a warning. He carried a hickory stick indoors just in case. Keeping the fire going became a quiet theatre of its own. The fire tender, an unofficial, post of great responsibility and approximately zero glamour, would prod and poke the embers every hour, creating a choreography of crackles and shadows on the walls. It was hypnotic, meditative, only interrupted every so often by the collapse of a log, which always managed to sound like a loaf of bread falling dramatically off a shelf. These slow rituals weren't just survival, they were grounding, anchoring time in acts of warming and watching, little rituals in the waxy quiet of an old-world winter. And so, as the long dark lingered and the landscape froze solid enough to echo, the settlers leaned into the rhythm. They listened to the slow hiss of snow brushing against wood, the low burble of stew settling toward edible. They drank the heat of silence in spoonfuls, finding its taste surprisingly bittersweet. Eventually, the moon would rise high enough to shine through frost-covered windows, laying silver across the cabin floor. A child might stir, a spoon may clink, but otherwise, nothing moved, and nothing needed to. Tomorrow would be full of frost and firewood, but tonight, something softer whispered through the timbers, reminding them that stillness too had a story of its own. And somewhere, in another cabin down the slope, a different firelight flickered. A hand reached for another log, another tale kindling behind sleepy eyes. It's a curious thing, how snow, a blanket laid silently across the land, can somehow make everything louder. Or perhaps it simply hushes the world just enough for you to hear what was always there. The creak of old floorboards, a kettle whispering on the hearth, the tiniest sigh of wind nudging its way past a crooked window pane. By the time the early settlers faced their first true winter in the northern reaches, places like colonial New England, up through the wilder corners of Canada and the fir-thick forests of the Great Lakes, they began to listen differently. Winter was not just a season, it was a patient teacher with frostbite on its knuckles and peculiar opinions on how loudly a person should sneeze when the cabin walls are made of pine and good intentions. Inside these cabins, families slowly adjusted to lives that stretched across snowbound months, like a quilt too large to fold. Days were short, dim, and often smeared with medicine-brown light from windows made of oiled paper, or, if fortune had smiled, imported glass. Night seemed to bend time itself, with stars so bright above the forest that even the smallest child understood, deep in their bones, what it meant to be quiet with awe. This was the season of stillness, but it was also when ingenuity stirred. Imagine a one-room log cabin. It smells faintly of firewood, boiled roots, and whatever stew is attempting to pass as delicious with the help of salt pork and wishful thinking. The air swells with the frugality of survival. Yet here, in this cramped, smoky little universe, invention thrived. Not in the grandeur, Vincian sense, but in everyday household miracles. Rag dolls and chessboards carved from leftover firewood, candle molds shaped from hollowed turnips, quilts patched with faded linen and folded stories, each square tugging a bit of light into threadbare corners. Every object, no matter how simple, had to be honest, durable, and preferably not frozen solid by breakfast. Children had their own kind of endless winter curriculum. Lessons included how to not touch the stove, even if it looks cozy, proper etiquette for sharing one blanket with 3 siblings, and the advanced seminar, snow socks, and the art of drying them by squatting near the fire without catching yourself on fire. Adults, meanwhile, became experts at the slow choreography of cabin life. Moving from chair to kettle to hearth was a finely tuned dance, especially when every misplaced kettle could mean melted snow in your shoes, or the dog stealing what little was left of last night's rabbit. And yet, people found joy in this winter hush. There were songs, many of them strange little ditties passed down from someone's grandmother who'd allegedly fought off wolves with a broom and sarcasm. Rhymes emerged, keeping time with the rhythmic crunch of chores or the lull of the spinning wheel. And stories, oh, the stories spun around that fire. Some were inherited from far-off homelands, German fairy tales softened for sleepless children, French folk tales tucked into English syllables, Gaelic ghost stories that sat a little too comfortably beside the chimney flue. But there were also newer tales, freshly minted from the snow itself. Tales about the frozen cow that gave better milk because it had seen God's fridge, or the neighbor who accidentally invented snowshoes by tying fence slats to his boots while chasing his cap into a snowdrift. It was easy, in those dragging days of January, to forget that grass once existed and that vegetables didn't always arrive pickled or brined into submission. So storytellers, intentionally or not, became keepers of a kind of hope, binding frostbitten evenings together with the invisible thread of imagination. There was magic, of a sort, in surviving winter as a group. It wasn't glamorous. No capes flapping in moonlight, just shared silences between sentences. The unspoken agreement that nobody needed to talk when the fire popped in just the right way. And the warm understanding that a nod across the room said, "Still here," better than any words could. Outside, the snow deepened, swallowing paths, fences, footsteps, all sound buried under a silence so vast it seemed to bring its own echo. Inside, the warmth might only extend a few feet from the fireplace, but within that soft perimeter of heat and history, humanity endured and evolved with a quiet resilience. Soon, the settlers would begin to notice the change in the light. A few seconds more sun each day. A bird returning, or maybe not returning, but pretending to. And with that tiny shift, plans would begin to stir. But not just yet. Not before one more tale by lamplight, and the peculiar case of a snowstorm that delivered oranges. Beneath the thick eiderdown of snow that muffled the countryside, early settler homes thumped softly with the creak of timber beams contending with winter's tightening grip. And somewhere between dawn's absence and the dullest hour of afternoon, the business of surviving slowed to a pace best described as contemplative, which is a kind word for incredibly, monumentally uneventful. In other words, a perfect setting for indoor activities of the most thrillingly dull variety. Let us drift, slippers on, into one such humble cabin in central Massachusetts, circa 1704. A one-room structure with chinking between the logs and a door that obligingly whined when opened, but always remembered to close. Inside, the air is a brothy mix of wood smoke and boiled turnip. The hearth blinks lazily with an orange glow, and near it sits a woman named Hepzibah, yes, real name, with a crocheted bonnet and opinions stronger than any tea she could afford. Hepzibah is about to begin what settlers reverently called the Great Indoor Month. Longer than a day, not quite a lifetime. This was the seasonal interval when life became a slow-motion tableau of necessity and patience. The snow outside whispered no, and the house inside whispered hush. Every morning began with the monotonous miracle of firewood ration math. There was the outer stack for particularly brave logs, the inner stack for training logs, and the hoarded stash hidden behind a quilt, reserved for real emergencies, like surprise visitors or morale collapses. Meals, too, became a game of edible Tetris. The November squash was now sad and deflated, but still convincingly dinner-shaped. Salted pork slices were thin enough to pass for bookmarks, and milk had retired to a career in icicle modelling. Yet through the miracle of boiled things and a pinch of determination, sustenance manifested, if not enthusiastically, at least regularly. Entertainment, you ask? Imagine a time when everyone was the entertainment, whether they liked it or not. By the hearth, young Obadiah, Hepzibah's 10-year-old, known for being both inquisitive and vaguely sticky, collected icicle drops in a tin mug for sport. His older sister Patience, misleadingly named, attempted embroidery with grim precision, periodically casting a deadly look when her thread knotted just so. Hepzibah herself enjoyed reading aloud from the good book, although her dramatic renditions occasionally drifted into what can only be described as low-budget theatre. Her rendition of Jonah in the Whale had been so impassioned last week that even the family cat reconsidered its atheism. And then came mending. Oh, how things tore, wore, and misbehaved. Mittens became fingerless before it was fashionable. Trousers developed independent leg philosophies, and socks returned from the wash as tragic monologues of holes. Hepzibah mended with such speed and scorn that even torn cloth became well-behaved just to avoid her sharp needle. Outside, the world pressed a frost-kissed silence onto every branch and rooftop. The snow had a way of settling not just over the land, but also between thoughts. Time itself seemed to pause, eager perhaps to observe how long humans could entertain themselves before going batty. Yet even within that muffled stretch of days, settlers found a peculiar rhythm. The darkness invited not despair, but stillness. People huddled close, spoke quietly, and began to truly notice the way chimney smoke curled and vanished like ghostly dancers. How snowflakes arriving on mittens looked like perfect lace before melting away, or how the creak of the roof beams at midnight sounded remarkably like a hesitant lullaby, and how, despite everything, they laughed, a stubborn, necessary, defiant laugh, because nothing says resilience quite like making terrible, endless puns about snow while you peel yet another potato by firelight. Some even composed riddles or tried their hand at spinning eerie stories, though most were abruptly halted by a sharp look from someone who'd heard that one before, thank you very much. But in this strange, suspended world, the everyday transformed into something grand. A kettle boiling could become suspenseful. A draft under the door was something to debate. And oh, when someone sneezed, 5 people would pause to investigate it like it was a new comet. These were winter's strange and quiet gifts. Time to watch, to listen, to just be. The snow outside made its moonlit promises, blanketing hardship in a whisper soft silence. Meanwhile, inside, Hepzibah adjusted her bonnet, glanced at the flickering hearth, and announced that it was time for the reading of another list. Not a story, mind you, a list of who owed how many stitches, by name and infraction. And so, with little fanfare and even less speed, the longest nights drifted by. Outside, the snow whispered. Inside, the fire blinked. And somewhere in this suspended hush of hearth and frost-kissed wood, preparations for the next odd tradition began. The quiet chaos of homegrown medicine and early remedies. What passed for healthcare when fever was a complete diagnosis, and lard could apparently fix anything. But that is a tale we'll tend to with warm flannel and a wink. The snow had fallen heavy the night before, fat flakes the size of a shilling, fat enough to silence wagon wheels and even the gossip of chimney swifts tucked away in their nests. By morning, the village was no longer a place of picket fences and muddy lanes, but a white, shrouded hush. Roofs wore soft bonnets. Icicles draped eaves like glass daggers forgotten in a hurry, and every tree looked as though it had tried on a powdered wig for some kind of frozen opera. It was in this snugly muffled world that the settlers performed one of winter's most sacred rituals, absolutely nothing. Now, doing nothing was not as easy as it sounds. In summer, it was physically impossible. There were fields to tend and cows to remind, gently, with a bucket, that their milk wasn't going to extract itself. But winter, our winter, was when time took off its boots and sat by the fire. These long, slow months transformed practical folk into professional wool gazers and highly trained fire stirrers. There was the fire stirrer who swore by 3 pokes per half hour, not 2, not 4, and the neighbour across the way who countered, hotly, that only amateurs didn't rotate the logs. Thus unfolded what we might call frontier philosophy. Heated debates over literal heat. Within the log cabins, the interior world grew richer, while the exterior disappeared under snowdrifts. Mrs. Eliza Timberthwaite, matriarch of the northernmost family, spent midwinter recounting every member of her family lineage, several of whom existed only in the vastly creative mist of memory. Great-aunt Lucretia, she would begin, could speak fluent French. Well, she at least understood a baguette when she saw one. The children, with boots lined in rabbit fur and layered to twice their usual volume, spent midday hours tracking invisible beasts through the woods. In truth, they were mostly following their own boot prints in wild and inefficient loops. Occasionally, one would declare with great urgency, "That's no rabbit print. That's the ice beast." The ice beast, much like Great-aunt Lucretia's language skills, was a fabrication, but a sacred one. It bore the noble duty of explaining what made the privy door creak at night, and why onions sometimes vanished from the root cellar. Strangely, the ice beast always had muddy boots, remarkably similar to young Levi's. Life inside moved largely at the pace of a gently boiling pot. Stews were king, because anything could be a stew if you gave it hot. Broth and enough time. Salt pork and turnip, stew. Old carrot, lentils, and what might have once been meat, stew, and possibly an exorcism. Bread was rationed like poetry, checked for mold, cut reverently, and held in the palm like gold. Evenings were for stories, spoken aloud by orange firelight. Not just bawdy tales or old country sagas, but strange local legends born from boredom and flickering shadows. There was the tale of Jasper Leak, who hibernated one February instead of chopping wood and awoke to find his beard frozen to the floor. Or the ballad of Mary Spoon, famed for knitting an entire shawl without once realizing the yarn was still attached to the family cat. Time grew woolly and soft around the edges, like the mittens everyone wore tied to their sleeves with lengths of old string. There was no strict distinction between Tuesday and Wednesday when the sun barely rose, and the moon seemed to be running an extended shift. And yet, in this slowed-down, snow-blanketed realm, something marvelous stirred. Muscles softened, but imaginations sharpened. Deprived of action, they dreamt of lush springs and wandering geese, of citrus fruit their mouths could barely remember, of new songs for next year's harvest gathering. One might say that winter was their dreaming season, the slow exhale of a long-held breath after the flurry of planting, tending, reaping, storing. By candlelight, many took ink to paper, if only to write half a letter or make a crude sketch of a neighbour's forehead, which, from certain angles, resembled a cow. Even modest literacy blossomed under snow. With chores paused and lanterns burning low, pens moved in thoughtful circles, and children listened longer than usual. Outside, the snow kept its quiet promise, covering all sins, turning rough trails into soft sculpture. And in one small cabin, as someone pressed their palm to the thick, icy pane of a frosted window, they didn't see a dark night. They saw the soft glimmer of snowlight, the moon's hush reaching earth. It was then that the wind, never one for knocking, curled around the corners of the house and whispered secrets through the cracks in the doorframe, of distant embers and quilted beds and frozen footprints that led to something just out of sight. When winter settled in over the northern colonies, it didn't knock politely or shake the snow off its boots. It barreled in like a frostbitten relative no one quite remembered inviting. By December, the rivers had frozen stiff, the fields lay buried beneath quilts of white, and the sun clocked out early with nary a word of apology. It was in this wide quiet that the settlers adjusted their lives into a slower rhythm. The kind of rhythm where your biggest appointment all day might be refilling the woodpile or convincing the goat that no, it could not sleep in your bed just because it was cold. In the lean months, time and sound both seemed to stretch. Gone were the buzzing summer insects and clattering wagon wheels. Instead, silence thickened in the corners of log cabins, broken only by the occasional hiss of logs on the hearth or the soft, rhythmic scraping of knitting needles. This was an era when silence wasn't empty. It was full, padded with the hush of snow-covered roofs and the knowledge that everything outside was too cold to move. Within the walls of these early homes, wooden fortresses against the frost, the settlers turned to winter tasks that needed less daylight but more patience. Mending harnesses, greasing tools, darning endless socks that seemed to wear thin purely from the effort of existing. These jobs weren't glamorous, but they were the soft gears that kept the homestead machine humming. And in the evenings, when candles were trimmed and bellies warmly filled with whatever deliciously questionable stew the cellar could provide, something rare and wonderful happened. People sat still, just sat together. Sometimes around a glowing hearth, sometimes in the muted flicker of a tallow lamp that smelled faintly of old sheep and bad decisions. The pace of conversation slowed too, like voices knew not to stir the air too much, afraid it might crack from the cold. Storytelling flourished in this hush. Grandparents became the family's human libraries, offering tales that were half history, half invention, and entirely captivating. Children listened wide-eyed, uncertain whether great-uncle Ezekiel had truly survived that wolf attack, with only a wooden spoon and a surprisingly aggressive glare, but willing to believe anything in the comfort of snow-muffled stillness. Poetry, too, found its way into homes, not the kind with romantic odes to distant lovers, but the rough-hewn kind written with ink made from leftover soot and desperation. Some settlers even kept journals, inscribing daily reflections with stoic observations like, January 14th, cold, snowed again. Caught young Jeremiah attempting to sled downhill using the family breadboard. Bread now oval, morale high. The isolation of winter had a paradoxical effect on community. While travel was difficult and visitors rare, especially the kind bearing suspiciously cheerful fruitcakes, neighbors still found inventive ways to connect. If paths were cleared and weather judged only mildly lethal, they might gather for a quilting bee, a husking bee, or one truly wild evening involving molasses pulling, which sounds faintly scandalous, but mostly just sticky. Even the animals observed winter's lull. Chickens laid fewer eggs. Cows grudgingly trudged to the barnyard with a look that said, "You could have chosen Jamaica, but here we are." Dogs nestled closer to the hearth, partly for warmth, partly because they'd wisely noticed no one had bathed in 2 weeks and were concerned for their people. Though harsh, this stretch of cold and quiet also had its secret charms. Morning frost left lace on every window pane, a delicate pattern more intricate than any embroidery. Chimneys sent up their smoke in slow curls, marking homes like tiny lighthouses amid oceans of snow. Each long night gave way to stories, laughter muffled under quilts, and a sense, simple but sure, that surviving together was more comforting than thriving alone. As night deepened and wind curled playfully through the eaves, the settlers tucked in with heavy blankets and heavier dreams. Outside, the snow whispered against the windows, a gentle lullaby in white. And deep in the silence, something else stirred, not loud or sudden, but the soft creak of a door in a neighboring homestead, where another tale was just beginning to unfold. The snow was not just a seasonal inconvenience to the early settlers, it was a certain kind of language, not loud like the shouting winds or verbose like the frontier gossip. No, snow whispered. It muffled horses' hooves, silenced axes mid-swing, softened the edges of hard days. And when the world outside turned as white and still as a clean parchment, it was as if the land itself were waiting for someone to write something meaningful upon it. Instead, the settlers wrote chicken scratch poetry in shovel lines across the path to the outhouse. With every flake that blanketed the thatched rooftops and crept along the windowsills, the little cabins of North America's early colonists became their own secluded planets. Spinning gently in the silent vastness of a frostbitten universe. Inside these one-room strongholds of questionable insulation, life narrowed its gaze. Family members, previously too busy with the chores of survival to speak more than a few grunts and pass the salt pork, were now essentially trapped with each other and their own personal aroma for weeks. Candles flickered, the fire crackled, and so did the knees of anyone over the age of 30. Bedding was layered like lasagna. Wool, flannel, homespun sheets stiff from cold, and a quilt thicker than a literate ox. Children, who were biologically incapable of staying still, burrowed like squirrels beneath it all, an occasional giggle or foot poke alerting the adults that they were still alive. Around this time of year, storytelling took on the role of entertainment, moral instruction, and light cardio when tales got animated. Grandma, perched in her creaking rocker, might recount how she once saw a swarm of bees freeze mid-flight in the Yukon wind. A preposterous tale, of course, but no one asked too many questions. After all, she did once throw a raccoon out of her pantry with nothing but a broom and a glare. Storytelling was a kind of magic, performed with the expectation of disbelief. Fathers told tall tales of winters so cold that whiskey turned to slush and dogs complained in fluent English. Children gasped, even though they'd heard it 15 times. Some tales were warnings dressed as fantasy, of neighbors who failed to bring in their goats before the first frost and wound up with what essentially became livestock-shaped snowmen. Food, too, was storytelling in edible form. Salted meats hung in the pantry like sleeping bats. Apples, wrapped in sawdust and placed lovingly in barrels, emerged months later more wrinkled than Uncle Silas, but still able to bake into something vaguely nutritious. Bread, hard enough to chip a new nation's molars, was softened with broth and hope, and every now and then someone would produce a molasses cookie, and for a brief moment unity reigned, even if it was only over the last bite. Winter games emerged from both ingenuity and sheer desperation. A popular favorite involved bouncing beans off a tabletop into a hat. Another, less cherished one, saw family members guessing which person in the room passed gas in the middle of a hymn. It was, by all measurements, a low-scoring winter. The eldest members of the household, revered for their experience and their ability to snore in Morse code, often presided over long evenings of letter writing. These weren't the swift Victorian scribbles of courtship and scandal. No, settler letters were pondered, drafted, often paused due to frostbitten ink. After 20 minutes of warming the nib of a goose feather quill near the hearth, most letters began and ended with cold, otherwise alive. But despite the discomfort, there was a strange sort of peace. With snow sealing the world shut like a silent pact, choices fell away. No errands, no journeys, no wondering whether to say yes to a barn raising invitation or fake a toothache again. Life was pared down, like a good soup, simple stock, quiet flavors, and left to simmer through the hours. Somehow, with each shiver and shared story, bonds grew tighter. Laughter echoed louder in small rooms. And while the wolves howled far off in the woods, inside, there was warmth enough to last one more night. And as night once again tucked its vast darkness around the tiny hearth-lit cabins, a curious shift was beginning to happen in those dream-heavy hours. One where the rhythms of the winter days began to shape not just survival, but an evolving culture of waiting, watching, and wondering about what life beyond the thaw might bring. At the edge of the forest, past the line where the tired oak trees slumped like old men napping in the snow, there stood a cabin with a roof too low for ambition, but just right for survival. Its chimney leaned slightly left, as if it too had grown weary of straight lines and preferred to drift like smoke in the wind. Inside, a woman named Ruth Elizabeth Pratt was braiding corn-husk dolls by candlelight. And the dolls, it must be said, appeared more startled than sweet. But that was just Ruth's style. Her fingers were quick, her stories quicker, and her tea dreadful. It was 1814, or close enough to it that no one bothered arguing. Calendars were more suggestions than commandments, especially in these frost-nipped corners of early American settlements, where the sun hesitated to rise and the roosters had learned not to expect too much from life. By this time in winter, the landscape had become a pale, creaking silence. Snow fell like unspoken opinions. Roads disappeared, wagons stayed still, and neighbors began sending word by tossing snowballs with notes wrapped inside, a local mail system full of enthusiasm and wet paper. On evenings like this, Ruth would sit by the hearth with her husband Silas, a man so large his shadow looked like a second cabin. Silas didn't talk much, and when he did, it was mostly to the fire, which he believed understood him better than most humans. Ruth, on the other hand, had conversations with nearly everything. Spoons, cats, drafty windows. Even the floorboards had characters. The groaner near the stove was Ezra, the squeaker under the bed was Mercy, and the one that never made a sound, well, that one was surely hiding something. They passed the time as all settlers did in the hush of deep winter, mending, spinning, sharpening, storytelling, and quietly waiting to see who would snap from cabin fever first. Games were invented with the most desperate creativity. Button string races were intense affairs, and nobody ever forgot the notorious checkers dispute of 11, in which two brothers ceased speaking for 3 years over a double-jump misunderstanding. Ruth told that story often, usually while whittling something unsettling. It was during this particular winter that the Pratt family decided, boldly and perhaps unreasonably, to attempt a raisin pudding. Now in truth, pudding was a generous word. It was more of a beige lump with aspirations. Lacking eggs, sugar, and consistency, they repaired to molasses, mashed turnip, and good old community optimism. Not a single family in the valley had ever produced a satisfactory winter pudding, but Ruth believed. She had spirit. She also had raisins, which were illegal tender in some parts of the frontier by virtue of scarcity. The pudding was assembled with all hands on deck. Even old Uncle Lemuel came out of his rocking chair, complaining that spending 6 hours hardening into a chair's wood grain made a man wise, if inflexible. Under Ruth's command, the mixing began. Some argued for flour first, some for milk. The baby threw in a button. They stirred clockwise for luck, then counterclockwise for contrariness. It was, by all measures, a family event. The baking, or rather the barely warming process, took place in a Dutch oven suspended over smouldering coals. For 3 hours, the family sat around it like it might reveal their future, as if the pudding was some kind of weather prophet or shy oracle. It emerged with the colour of uncertainty and the texture of apology. Still, they gathered around. Silas took the first bite and nodded solemnly. It tastes like memory. Whose memory? Asked Ruth. Grandma's, but not cooking. More like her church hat. This, oddly, was taken as high praise. Grandma's church hat was legendary for its complexity and floral notes. And so the pudding was deemed a success, not because it was good, it wasn't, nor nourishing, dubious, but because it was shared. That more than anything was winter's unspoken contract. Togetherness was near law. Snow might silence the road, freeze the stream, and seal the door, but it could never still the human urge to gather, laugh, create strange desserts, and hope for spring. As the wind howled gentle secrets outside and the candle surrendered into starlight, Ruth sat back with a pleased sigh and held the baby close, its breath puffing little questions into the air. Tomorrow, they would try soap making, which always made the air smell like moral discipline and lie. But that was a concern for the next sunless morning, when the soap pot boiled and the rules of chemistry were once again subjected to frontier interpretation. For now, they slept, held tightly together in a cabin of whispers, dreams and pudding crumbs, gently waiting for the next small adventure the snow might bring. The wind, that quiet and persistent artist of winter, had been sculpting the prairies with such diligence that early settlers could swear they'd spent the entire season living inside a snow globe, upside down, shaken often, and sealed in silence. On some nights, the snow came so thick it seemed to blanket time itself. Chimneys exhaled tiny ghosts into the night air, while firelight flickered within, catching on the eyes of half-asleep cats and the dull shine of tin kettles. It was in this muffled world that the settlers perfected an ancient art, doing absolutely nothing with exceptional effort. You see, in warmer seasons, life had rhythm, things to plant, cows to chase, fences that insist on needing fixing. But winter excelled in monotony. Entire days passed in such uniform quiet that a sneeze could become a headline. There wasn't much to do except keep the fire going and keep your toes from going elsewhere. And yet, in a manner no modern hurry could quite reproduce, long winter nights drew people not into boredom, but into reflection. With their boots drying by the hearth and their bread dough rising at the speed of tectonic plates, they'd pass time with storytelling, or better yet, with staring at the wall. Deep, philosophical stares, the kind only possible when your only entertainment is a whittled spoon and the low whistle of wind creeping through knotholes in the wall. Even animals got in on the silent routine. Chickens, deprived of daylight and thus their sense of ambition, sat still in their cozy corners, quietly judging humans for inventing February in the first place. Dogs curled up by the fire with the grim patience of those who had once chased rabbits and now merely dreamed of the chase. And the cows, their breath puffing out in small white bursts inside frost-rimmed barns, became existentialist poets, staring into middle distance like beasts who had seen too many snowstorms and not enough spring. Still, not everything was idle. Some industrious souls spent winter evenings boiling down tallow to make candles. This, of course, had the twofold benefit of providing light and introducing the fragrant suggestion of mutton into every cranny of the log cabin. Candle making was a slow, drippy process. Wax, wick, dip, sigh, repeat. But it was more purposeful than most mid-winter tasks and gave the impression, however faint, that one was doing something important instead of simply waiting for the earth to tilt a little closer to the sun again. Others turned to quilting, small hands stabbing small needles into soft fabric, a rhythm of quiet industry that created warmth both literal and emotional. In many towns, quilts doubled as community gossip maps, with fabric sewn in from Cousin Martha's wedding dress or that shirt Uncle John wore when the ox escaped onto Main Street. Nothing preserved memory like a well-worn square of cotton stitched under layers of conversation. Reading, for those who had books, was the pinnacle of winter luxury. Novels were scarce and religious tracts plentiful, though one might argue that a particularly gloomy sermon could summon both education and dreamless sleep in equal measure. Bibles doubled as literature, family registers, and occasionally a last resort for pressing dried leaves or hiding cheeky notes after dinner. Pages were turned gently both out of reverence and because replacing them in a blizzard wasn't exactly convenient. And then there were diaries, the sacred vessels of cabin-bound confession. Written by lamplight and shivering fingers, early settlers poured their thoughts into these small leather-bound tomes. They recorded births, snow depths, bread failures, and an inordinate amount of concern about that creaky sound the roof made on Tuesday. These diaries tell us today not just what happened then, but how deeply quiet that world could be, how vast and slow and shimmering a single winter's night could feel. As dusk deepened and the fire crackled in its lowest, laziest pitches, families would gather for moments of nothing in particular. They'd listen to the wind elbowing its way through tree limbs, or the occasional thunk of snow slipping from a roof. In that unhurried silence, time spread out like a featherbed, and even the smallest warmth, a cocoa-kissed hearth, a shared grin, seemed momentous. And somewhere, tucked in a cradle draped with a quilt that knew too much, a baby dreamed the slow, snow-glazed dreams of a world still sleeping. Just beyond that cabin, beneath drifts that wrapped the earth like lullabies, a secret was waiting in the frozen woodpile. But that, as it warms, is another story. The clocks didn't tick. There were no clocks. The icicles served as the only timepieces, melting a little slower each year, as though even time had decided that winter should last longer than necessary. Inside the little log, dwellings of early settlers, hours weren't counted. They were endured, then savoured, then finally forgotten, as the world beyond the frosted windows turned to a silent, muffled blur of white. If you were lucky, your cabin had a fireplace that didn't belch more smoke inside than it sent up the chimney. And if you were very lucky, someone in the home knew how to knit socks big enough to double as sleeping bags for your entire foot. And should fortune truly smile upon you, there was an uncle nearby, preferably a well-fed one, who told long, meandering stories that went nowhere and everywhere, helping the evening slog gently toward slumber. The settlers, you see, perfected the art of doing absolutely nothing in winter. And they did it well, with nowhere to go and no roads to get there even if they wanted to. Families spent entire weeks cocooned together like hibernating squirrels, trading gossip, ghost tales, and the last half jar of pickled something that had turned mysteriously purple. It was during these moon-hung evenings that every sound mattered. The creak of dry timber overhead was no longer just a creak. It was a ticking reminder that the snow on the roof was heavy, and that the roof had feelings it hadn't shared yet. A gust of wind might whistle through the gaps in the chinking between the logs, and the youngest child might decide once again that yes, maybe it was a banshee outside, after all. But these fears were only half-hearted, performed more for the sake of tradition than from true fright. Because in homes lined with dried herbs hanging like upside-down saints, the darkness didn't feel quite so threatening. It felt like a heavy quilt stitched from years of survival. And if you listen closely, you might hear potatoes rolling slightly in the root cellar below, the sound of dinner waiting, planning its unnecessary rebellion. Most cabins had a central hearth, not just for warmth, but for reassurance. A fire that stayed burning meant that life too kept smouldering along. A fire gone out was a small tragedy, not only because it meant cold toes, but because it meant restarting it using flint, steel, and profanity. The children would sit nearest the flames, fighting both boredom and the urge to ask infuriating questions with no answers like, why is snow white? Or do trees sleep? Or what if butter catches on fire? The older members of the family would sigh and gaze into the embers, not because they were reflective philosophers, but because zoning out was the only known cure for cabin fever, besides aggressively knitting your way through emotional distress. Knitting, incidentally, became an Olympic-level event during winter, not because people were particularly gifted, but because it offered the illusion of activity while seated. Mufflers that could wrap around the chimney, hats shaped more like buckets, mittens somehow missing thumbs. It didn't matter. The point wasn't beauty. The point was staying warm even if you looked like a suspiciously well-dressed turnip. Evenings passed in rhythms, the snapping of frost on the window panes like applause for surviving another hour, the soft grumble of a stomach deciding it wouldn't wait until sunrise, the rhythmic scrape of a knife against wood as Grandpa whittled what he claimed would be a spoon, but looked increasingly like a weaponized platypus. And then, always, there would come a hush, a deeper quiet than the rest. The moment when the fire grew lower, when the wind outside didn't even whisper anymore. That almost sacred silence when time, snow, and settlers all paused together, wrapped in one long breath. No, these nights were not empty. They were full in a way only slowness can teach. Settlers didn't have insulation, thermostats, or podcasts about Stoic philosophy. Their wisdom came from listening to snow, to silence, and to each other's snores echoing under pine beam ceilings. As the last candle flickered into a tiny gasp of smoke, and the milk-frozen cats curled closer to the hearth, one couldn't help but wonder what dreams might await in homes like these. Dreams flavored faintly with turnip soup and lingering pine smoke. Dreams carved slowly, like the days themselves. And sometime just before the first blue glimmers of morning winter light, someone awoke, stirred the fire, and pulled the quilts tighter. Because tomorrow, well, tomorrow might bring a surprise visitor on snowshoes with a pack full of letters, or more likely, with an unusually emotional chicken. And yes, tales of both await by the faint gold of morning. The hearth crackled with exaggerated purpose, as though it sensed that its flickering performance was the evening's only entertainment. Outside, the world was buried. Not in paperwork or drama, mercifully, but in snow so thick it looked like some celestial baker had gotten distracted while sifting flour across the land. The winds had finally hushed, leaving only the fuzzy quiet that blankets the earth when snow has its way. It wasn't just winter. It was the kind of winter that made porridge look luxurious and playing charades feel like an Olympic sport. Inside their low-roofed cabins, early settlers leaned hard into the art of waiting for spring, for the ground to thaw, for toes to regain sensation, but mostly waiting for the stories to start. Because when snow silences the world, even the most stoic farmer turns philosopher by the fire. Evenings rolled in like thick wool blankets pulled across the sky. Candlelight flickered faint golden halos on rough-hewn walls. Families huddled together under itchy quilts that smelled faintly of sheep and adventure. Children sat cross-legged, wide-eyed, not because they weren't tired, but because tonight might be the night grandmother told the one about the fox and the honey barrel, with voices this time. And truth be told, they'd already perfected the fine winter skill of appearing riveted while slowly dozing off. Their parents, meanwhile, had other winter tricks. Long before modern gadgets could lure us into obsessive scrolling, settlers had their own sort of analog pastimes. Button-string toys, carved wood puzzles, darning socks in creative patterns that might pass as fashion if you'd never seen Paris or pants without holes. But the most cherished of all indoor rituals was the sharing of tales, especially the kind you couldn't say in summer, when chores and daylight lingered too long for nonsense. And so, Grandpa Elias might lean back in his corner chair, give a small theatrical cough, the ancient auditory symbol for brace yourself for wisdom or nonsense, and begin. Now keep in mind, not every story shared during those snowy weeks was historically accurate. Take, for example, the tale of the ice cow. As Grandpa Elias told it, the ice cow was a great spectral beast that roamed the forest after the second frost moon, mooing so low and so mournfully that anyone who heard it would wake up craving butter. A sign, he claimed, that snow would stick around for another 6 weeks, and that you best not ration the salt pork too generously. Of course, the accuracy of this weather prediction method was statistically adorable. But in an era before Doppler radar and morning email alerts about black ice, you took your omens where you could get them. One winter, a particularly convincing ice cow haunting had settlers in 3 counties making cheese till April. Spectacularly mouldy cheese, but still. And there were the frozen time games, a rather somber competition among neighbours. Who could go longest without mentioning how cold it was? It was vigorous mental exercise. The phrase brisk morning was permitted. Chilly bones was discouraged. But frozen death fingers led to disqualification, unless, of course, your actual fingers were frozen, in which case someone would help you find them. The long nights also nurtured a quieter kind of industry. Far from idleness, winter was sowing season, carving season, contemplating how many turnips are left season. Some settlers kept journals or invented elaborate schemes for spring gardens they'd absolutely abandoned by June. Others, more enthusiastic about self-improvement, devised spiritual resolutions while lying flat on their backs on straw beds, watching their own breath make small ghosts in the cold air. And during those hushed hours, when flames were reduced to soft embers and the wind outside scribbled frost-ruined poetry on every pane of glass, settlers sometimes dared to imagine what life might be like on the other side of the Atlantic, or what strange peoples existed beyond the forests, beyond the rivers, beyond the absence of anything resembling a decent tavern. They dreamed in woolen layers, wrapped tightly with whispers, sighs, and the collective wish that maybe spring this year would come early and stay longer. The silence of the snow was not an empty one. It was layered with myth, with memory, and with moments so gentle they barely left footprints. The kind of silence that lets you hear your own heartbeat, and then, just as faintly, someone else's. And as another flame curled into itself and fell asleep in the hearth, the cold creaked in the rafters like an old friend shifting in his chair, offering nothing but the comfort of familiarity. But when morning came, but there was a meeting at the sugaring shed, and a mystery that began not with a scream, but with missing spoons and suspicious squirrel prints. The fire spit once, a gentle crackle at the edge of the hearth, before settling into its usual low murmur like a very old man muttering secrets to his slippers. Outside, snow was beginning again, soft as powdered sugar poured from a cloud's own teapot, and deep within the hush of an early settler cabin, the night was turning inward, quiet and a little whimsical in the way only deeply silent wintry nights can be. It was on nights like these that early settlers turned to the curious art of candle economy. Yes, candle economy. Not candle making, not candle buying, but the rigorous, strategic military campaign of keeping a candle alive longer than common sense deemed necessary. Candles were precious. Made from tallow if you were thrifty, beeswax if you were lucky or wealthy, or perhaps just in close proximity to a very industrious bee. Tallow candles smelled, let's be diplomatic, they had a personality. Imagine lighting a candle that reminded you every second that it used to be part of a cow, a smoky, meaty bouquet that filled the room with the cozy ambience of a slowly roasted barnyard. So to preserve resources and spare their noses, settlers got creative. They cut candle wicks short to make the flame dimmer. They propped reflective surfaces, sometimes just polished tin, behind candles to spread the light double, and they often gathered close together near the same source of light, not for intimacy, but pure mercenary enlightenment. They'd share one candle the way you might share a Netflix password today. Children learn to read by these faint flickers, squinting over slates and primers, their eyes growing stronger or, arguably, prematurely damaged by tiny flames fighting valiantly against the thick winter gloom. Parents, meanwhile, weren't skipping off to indulge in candlelit romance. They were spinning yarn, darning socks, or arguing quietly over who had moved the knitting needle last. Of course, all this budgeting of light had its consequences. For one, it often resulted in decision fatigue. By 4:30 p.m., sundown came scandalously early in January, and the family had to decide, would they light a candle and read their favorite sermon aloud again, or spend the evening pretending to find each other extremely interesting by firelight? More often than not, folks defaulted to a curiouser form of sleep informed by rhythm, darkness, and the collective sigh of the snow itself. Segmented sleep. In those days, people commonly slipped into a first sleep early in the evening, woke for a spell around midnight, then returned for a second sleep. The midnight intermission had an astounding range of uses: prayer, deep thoughts, checking to see whether the roof had collapsed under snowdrift, or quietly attending to biological adventures, though we'll let the old diaries do the blushing for us. During this wakeful window, settlers would stir up the fire, perhaps reheat a pocket pie, one of those utterly practical things that deserves a culinary rebranding. Picture a sturdy pastry filled with meat and root vegetables, hand-warming and belly-filling all at once. Wrapped in cloth and tucked into coat pockets, these pies were the original central heating. Outside, the snow continued its campaign of quiet conquest, muffling every sound, including, quite helpfully, the complaints of cows, chickens, and one especially fussy pig named Clem. Animals did not care for January, neither did the people, to be honest. But the silence of the snow offered a certain companionship, an affirmation that not doing anything in winter wasn't laziness, it was good manners. Even the birds had flown south to take a break from everything. So households leaned heavily into peace, candles aglow like little stars bribed down from the sky. Knitted mittens hung to dry on the mantel like sleepy bats. Tea was steeped not for flavor, but for warmth and moral encouragement. The smell of wood smoke settled into the walls, as if the trees were kindly visiting one last time, offering their final bits of comfort through flame. And just when the little cabin seemed to descend at last into full rest, just when the dog had finished turning in his blanket 6 times, and the wind's voice outside had faded to a soft, celestial hum, there might come a knock at the door. Not a loud one, just a polite, tired knock. Perhaps it was a neighbor, or the town's itinerant preacher looking for shelter from the night. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the start of a story stitched from snow, shadows, and something slightly unusual. It's hard to explain just how quiet winter could be for early settlers. not the peaceful quiet of modern times, where silence means the Wi-Fi's out and you're forced to confront your inner thoughts, but the kind of silence so deep, it settles on your shoulders like a woolen shawl and wraps your ears in frost. Out on the prairies or nestled in forest clearings, the absence of mechanical buzzes or clicking appliances made the snow-covered world feel cavernous. It was during these hush-hush months that time itself seemed to slow. The sun, perhaps tired of the daily performance, would yawn low on the horizon and excuse itself early. Dark would tiptoe in by late afternoon, as if it had RSVP'd to a very polite dinner. And what followed were long, ink-black hours where flickering candlelight became the lead actor in a one-room drama starring very cold people and a slowly cooling pot of stew. Amid all this serenity and sharp-edged chill, one particular winter pastime stood out: the art of doing absolutely nothing, but doing it very, very deliberately. Now, modern folks might call it mindfulness, or even hygge, if they're feeling particularly Scandinavian about it. But back then, it was called sitting still, so you don't waste calories. When the growing season was months behind, food was sealed in jars or buried in root cellars, and your nearest grocery store was a 4-day slog on snowshoes. A calm evening of not burning energy was just good economic sense. Folks would gather close around the hearth, which was both a literal and emotional center of the home. Its cracks and pops punctuated conversations that meandered like creek water through a lazy summer field. And if no one felt like talking, even better. Silence was premium-grade entertainment when your other options were churning butter or scraping candle stubs. Oh, and candlelight. Let's talk about that mesmerizing, shadow-tossing ally of the early winter evening. It smudged out the corners of the room, blurred the lines of work-worn faces, and made even the most tragic socks dancing over the nearby drying rack look like ancient footbound spirits. To stitch a sock by moonlight was not only next to impossible, it was considered poor taste. Instead, families turned to storytelling, one of the last forms of entertainment that could be powered entirely by breath and dramatic pauses. You'd get tales passed down from the old country, fables half remembered from some uncle's ale-soaked imagination, or the occasional true story featuring a bear encounter that grew progressively larger with each telling. The beauty of a dark, wind-wrapped evening was how it transformed every little noise into something notable. A crack on the window pane, easily a ghost, but probably just a tree branch. That gentle creaking of the wooden kitchen shelf, undoubtedly the long-lost grain spirit paying a visit, although more likely just the family cat attempting career advancement. Children, wrapped in wool and stuffed into mangy bedrolls like very polite sardines, would lie wide-eyed, half spooked and half delighted as the stories unspooled. They'd listen for the faint footsteps of snowshoes returning, or worse, heading away, because anyone traveling after dark clearly had either urgent business or very questionable decision-making skills. And then there were the snow gauges, not scientific instruments, but Grandpa's knees. If it's up to my second kneecap, it's going to be a 3-fire night, he'd grunt, placing another log onto the blaze. Families hedged their comfort on these weather-worn joints, trusting them over almanacs or church calendars. Remember, joints don't lie, not in the long winter, as the winds whispered like old friends across the gables. Time stitched people closer together, not out of romance or sentimentality necessarily, but good old-fashioned necessity. You sat near someone because they were warm, You talked to them because it passed time. And together, you endured the sameness of night through the shared warmth of presence. And just as one might expect, these nights weren't always so idyllic. Tempers could rise like poorly covered stew pots, and the close quarters tested even the most even-tempered souls. But somehow, the rhythm of the fire, the embrace of wool, and the patient hush of snow piled atop the roof spun annoyance into something quieter. Perhaps not affection, but definitely mutual survival. So the settlers pressed deeper under quilts. Dogs curled tighter on woven rugs. Tea cooled in tin cups left forgotten on windowsills. Outside, the stars blinked sleepy-eyed over sleeping barns, and the frost made lacework no human hand could match. But inside, in the chorus of creaks and sighs, the winter night held its grip, gentle, firm, and humming with the soft promise that morning wouldn't be too far away. And just when the fire gave its last flicker, someone remembered a story, a strange one. Something about a frozen cabbage and a traveling shoemaker. But that tale, that peculiar little mystery, would have to wait. Around this time of the endless winter, when the snow had accumulated like gossip in a small town, early settler families turned inward, physically toward their hearths, and mentally toward survival strategies that weren't entirely unlike modern family board games, except with significantly higher chances of frostbite. With the length of night stretching far beyond the reach of daylight, homes took on a rhythm more lullaby than lively. Candles were rationed carefully, like a miser would dole out compliments, only when absolutely necessary. The ambient light of flame flickered across rough-hewn beams and frost-quilted windows, casting dancing shadows that entertained more consistently than most winter guests. Evenings were the supreme moment of domestic improvisation, with livestock tethered snugly in adjacent lean-tos, sometimes within the house itself for extra warmth and, let's be honest, additional character-building smells. Human and animal lives blurred into a single sleepy unit. One pig apparently even learned to snore on cue, thereby qualifying as the village's earliest form of stand-up comedy. Children, swaddled like small mobile quilts, would gather with their parents near the fire, where someone, usually with a voice like warm porridge, would begin a story. Not always exciting tales, no quests, no dragons, often just recollections of how Uncle Thomas once fell into the river during midwinter and emerged with icicles in his beard and a renewed respect for footing. Or of Great Aunt Margaret's infamous apple pie hoarding technique. Apparently, she stored them in a box under the mattress, both apples and pies. A bold gamble, given the diversity of winter rodents. These oral traditions spun threads through time, weaving warmth into the hollowness of the cold. You didn't need excitement. You needed patience, wool, and the ability to hum hymns in key, if only just barely. Needles clicked as mittens were slowly born from soft, periodically unraveled yarn. Practical crafts became both a necessity and a sleepy sort of entertainment. You could watch snow pile against your window, knowing you had 2 new socks by the time the windowsill disappeared entirely. That, dear listener, is what 19th century folks called a productive Tuesday. Reading material was precious, often limited to the Bible, a heavily thumbed almanac, or, if a family was daringly literate, a tattered novel suspiciously filled with ambiguous romance and the occasional jewel. A bad winter might see the same few pages reread until the characters seemed intimately familiar. Well, one settler wife was recorded as saying, "If Lady Charlotte doesn't marry that insufferable duke by February, I shall do it myself. He has a good estate, Meanwhile, outside these tiny wooden fortresses, the quiet reigned like a benevolent queen. Snow served as both insulation and silence bringer. It muffled noise, bent tree limbs into sleepy curves, and erased footpaths as if smoothing the world into a single white breath. There's a kind of peace in that, isn't there? The landscape not just frozen, but paused. One could almost imagine the earth itself bundled up beneath that deep fluff, dreaming of spring roots. Weather permitted neither travel nor letters, which meant news from the outside arrived like a distant echo, weeks old and oddly sweet. For example, a notice about the Queen's latest hairstyle might inspire 10 fresh bonnets locally, even if the fashion at Buckingham had already moved on to something involving, say, feathers and mild regret. Yet it wasn't all quiet reflection and woolen socks. Occasionally, someone would suggest a parlour game, charades for instance, though whether it was intuitive to act out molasses while shivering in 6 layers is debatable. But for the early settlers, laughter was essential insulation, just like the moss stuffed between logs or the mystery stew that tasted different every night. Romance, too, slid in gently with the snow. There's something undeniably tender about courting when your primary method of flirtation is exchanging slightly less ugly mittens. Glances over candlelight, shared cups of chicory brew, and long-winded compliments about each other's ability to survive. These were all tokens of affection that could melt hearts, even when the ink froze in the inkwell. And so, the long night stretched onward, quiet and full of small, echoing moments. Nothing grand, just the daily miracle of people enduring the hush together. Simple joys, mumbled prayers, and the occasional surprise piglet birth in the pantry. Tonight, the snow on the roof whispers again, a soft creak like the turning of a heavy page. And if you tilt your ear just right, you might catch the rhythm of mittens being knit under candlelight, and an old tale being spun about a girl, a goose, and a miraculous pot of stew. Outside, the moon glows gently across the white-draped field, and inside, stories wait to be told. Compared to the howling gales and brittle frost of the outdoors, the settler's hearth was a miracle of humble defiance. At the first hiss and crackle of morning embers struck with flint, it was as though the house exhaled after holding its breath all night. Warmth was no guarantee in these parts. It had to be coaxed, like a shy cat offered a saucer of milk. Fires were never allowed to die completely. Banking the fire, burying glowing coals beneath ashes, was a sacred bedtime ritual, only slightly less important than prayer, and more immediate in its power to disappoint if skipped. Woe to the early settler who awoke to a stone-cold hearth and the long, brittle silence that followed. Rebuilding a fire from scratch in sub-zero weather was the kind of experience that made folks rethink ever wanting a frontier adventure in the first place. But perhaps more curious was the way the long darkness restructured the very fabric of time. In winter, early settlers lived by a rhythm alien to our modern tempo, with nightfall sneaking in by late afternoon and dawn dragging its heels until past breakfast. Days were swallowed into a heavy hush, but this was not just a matter of shorter daylight. No, it was a different psychological landscape. There existed, in fact, a forgotten marvel, a phenomenon historians have recently begun to sigh dreamily over, called segmented sleep. According to 17th and 18th century diaries, letters, and sermons, many people didn't sleep in one long modern block, but in 2 distinct intervals. A first sleep that lasted from dusk until midnight, followed by an hour or 2 of quiet wakefulness, and then a second sleep that carried them through till morning. Imagine it, a whole community gently awake in the middle of the night, not to scroll drowsily through glowing screens or wrestle with existential dread, but to tend a smouldering log, mend a sock, or perhaps, if feeling particularly wild, read from Psalms or recite a poem committed to memory. Sometimes a neighbour would stop by for tea, in the pitch black, with no doorbell. It was either a testament to unshakable trust or a complete lack of personal boundaries. Historians remain divided. Others use the midnight hours for prayer, reflection, or, as we'd say today, some emotionally repressed journaling. Candlelight, when it could be spared, bathed corners of cabins in dancing amber, helping thoughts that had lain dormant all day to rise and stretch during the hush between sleeps. The hours were quiet, but the mind, they say, was vivid. Sleep. Researchers in recent decades were positively giddy to rediscover this pattern. One suspects they celebrated with a very calm party and chamomile tea. Of course, industrialization eventually crushed the segmented sleep pattern under the shiny boots of regulated labor and electric lighting. But back during a long January freeze, when the wind sculpted the snow like frosting and no one was in a hurry, this gentle rhythm allowed dreams to pause for thought. And then there were the clothes. Never before or since has sleepwear been so simultaneously elaborate and ineffective. Nightcaps weren't just quaint headwear. No, they were practically required if one wanted to keep one's ears intact by morning. Without a central heating system, warmth was a strategic operation. Quilts layered thick as geological strata, socks were mandatory, and those truly committed might wrap a brick heated on the fire in cloth and nestle it at their feet. Interestingly, many settlers slept apart, not necessarily out of marital unrest, but because body heat, though effective, had its risks. One partner might shuffle about, unconsciously staging a full production of a winter ballet, while the other simply wanted to survive the night without being kicked in the shin. So separate beds, or blooming arrangements involving sheepskins, trundle beds, or a particularly pliant hound, became common enough. Sometimes, during those cold midnight wakings, a few restless souls would step outside. The silence of a snowy night was a thing to be heard, or rather, not heard. Snow absorbs sound like a smug magic trick, dampening even the rattle of branches or the gossiping of timbers adjusting to the freeze. And standing beneath sharp winter stars, breath fogging like pipe smoke, a settler might forget their aching back and cracked hands and simply marvel. At what? The stars, the quiet, the absurd shape of a neighbor's thatch. That remains their secret. But as the second sleep took hold, and the fire dimmed to a calm red shimmer beneath its grey coat of ash, the night would wrap its arms around the household once more. All was frozen still, but inside, time curled gently around itself, waiting for the next morning's hush. And beyond those glowing embers, in corners and snowdrifts, more curious tales were quietly gathering. There comes a time in every long winter when the novelty of snow wears off, and even the jolliest of settlers begin eyeing their frozen boots with suspicion. Their food stores shrink like wool in hot water, their candles burn ever shorter, and their neighbours, once charming in September, now chew too loudly. By the time February rolled around, it wasn't unusual to see a pioneer woman calmly mending a sock with one hand and flicking a bean at her husband with the other. Quietly, passive-aggressively, but lovingly. As silence blanketed the snowy landscape, something curious began to happen indoors. The cold drove everyone inside, And with limited distractions, no TikTok, no TV, not even a weather app, they turned to what little entertainment they had: storytelling, shadow puppets, complaining creatively, and perhaps most importantly, board games. Well, not exactly Monopoly. We're talking rustic diversions. In New England cabins, settlers repurposed whatever they had into games. Huckleberry pits became makeshift checkers pieces. Bits of yarn were traded like currency in a woolen version of poker. One recorded pastime from a Maine family involved guessing which family member was about to sneeze based on the twitch of their nose. Entertainment came cheap, and often with allergies. But long winter nights didn't only breed boredom. They also bred inventiveness. With nothing but time and candlelight, settlers, especially women, turned to intricate handicrafts. Lace-making became an art of patience and frostbitten fingertips. Some would unwind stray threads from worn-out clothing, dye them with beet juice or soot, and embroider scenes onto linen that told miniature stories of crops, pigs, or sunsets they hadn't seen in weeks. Little frozen soap operas in thread. A Massachusetts schoolteacher named Prudence Hallaby once stitched an entire Thanksgiving dinner onto a pillowcase using husked corn silk for the turkey stuffing. No one knew what inspired this, whether it was artistic ambition or simply culinary yearning. But either way, the pillow was said to taste like time for 3 winters afterward, according to her very confused dog. And then there were the diaries. In those dim months, even the least poetic settlers seemed to catch a whiff of inspiration from the cold itself. Hundreds of journals survive from this era, filled with icy observations and frigid philosophies. One farmer in Vermont described his frozen barn as an ark of mooing lamentations, while a minister in upstate New York wrote emotionally about his relationship with his mittens, praising their stoic companionship. Journaling became both refuge and therapy. Frozen fingers scribbled down everything from new stew recipes to deeply personal reflections titled "Why I Regret Trading the Last Apple for a Spoon." But perhaps the most cherished of evening rituals, more than embroidery, bean games, or mitten manifestos, was the moment when the entire family gathered around the hearth for what they called hush time. They didn't have Netflix, but they had Grandpa Jedediah. And while he didn't stream, he did narrate long meandering stories often involving talking foxes, magical turnips, or mildly anarchic goats with very clear political allegories. Nobody questioned where he got these stories, though it's suspected he mixed actual memories with dreams and casseroles. Hush time was sacred, sometimes bizarrely so. In one Pennsylvania homestead, the rule was that everyone had to have a hot stone in their lap during hush time. Not for tradition, but for warmth, and to keep restless children from wandering off mid-tale. When the temperature dropped below a certain point, even folklore became a hostage situation. And as the stories twisted and turned, as the fire dimmed and the wind scraped the shutters, every creak in the floor or howl from outside deepened the spell. Settlers would lapse into dreams full of the very things they talked about: talking goats, heroic mittens, suspiciously seductive soup. They would drift off, heads bobbing like content potatoes, wrapped in quilts patched from past year's stories, surrounded by the familiar scent of smoke, wool, and whatever had been burning on the stovetop. Outside, the snow kept falling, thick and slow as molasses. Inside, time folded upon itself, stretched by silence, propped up by imagination. What the early settlers built during those long nights wasn't just survival, it was memory. The kind that might not make a history textbook, but could keep a soul warm clear into spring. And tomorrow would come with more snow, another lukewarm breakfast, and perhaps, if everyone behaved, the continuation of Grandpa Jedediah's tale involving a goose who demanded back pay. But that, my dear listener, curled under your own blanket of hush time, drifts quietly forward into the next fire-lit moment. A windless hush had settled over the woods like a held breath. Out here, far beyond the reach of village bell towers or barking dogs, silence wasn't an absence. It was a presence, thick, weighty, like an extra woolen blanket draped over the timbered world. Snow rested on every opened branch and crooked roof, transforming the wilderness into something gentle and reluctant to move. And this, of course, is where the stillness worked its curious magic. Winter had always been the season when settlers finally sat down. The rest of the year had been a barn-raising sprint, chopping, hauling, planting, boiling, fermenting, yelling at pigs. But come December, those stubborn pioneers, some of them still clinging to thick accents from the old world, finally accepted that it was too cold to pretend otherwise. You couldn't plough frozen ground. The firewood was already chopped, more or less. Even horses had the good sense to flop their big, hairy hooves down and be quiet. What could you do but slide into your long johns, press your forehead to the butter churn lid to see who stored jam inside it, and wait? Nevertheless, they did not simply hibernate. Winter called for inventiveness, and the early settler household was never short on that. Out of boredom and necessity, they developed a rich inner life, of the domestic variety. For example, if you ever find yourself trapped indoors during a 12-day blizzard with nothing but beans and a temperamental cousin for company, you might also invent something like button strings. Children, wrapped like ducklings in many layers of someone else's clothes, would thread leftover buttons onto cords or pieces of twine, quietly inventing stories for each one. Every pearl button belonged to a captain's coat, every wooden one to a cheeky pig. When they weren't busy creating elaborate Civil War operas with button actors, women sat close by the hearth, darning socks. And by darning, we mean performing thread-based miracles on garments that looked more whole than hosiery. Sock surgery became a kind of winter performance art, conducted with bone needles and whispered prayers to St. Warmfeet. And then there were the shadows, those mellow, flickering ones that moved across cabin walls each evening like polite ghosts. The older folk would begin their stories, voices low and syrup thick, like molasses poured slow over biscuits. Some families narrated tales of how their great uncles tried to plough snow because they believed spring could be persuaded. Others recalled mysterious footprints that ended nowhere, just prints, then vanishing. Settler storytelling flourished in those long, flickering evenings. And while the facts of these tales were often vague, someone probably saw a bear, someone else sort of escaped wolves on a sled. They served as vital entertainment. That, and a handy way to keep kids well within a 10-foot radius after dark. Up in the loft, under scratchy wool quilts with names like Log Cabin Star or Tired Fox Burrow, the children would drift off, accompanied by the creaking of the logs, the pop of resin in the firewood, and the muffled cough of someone below using a snow shovel as a coat rack again. It wasn't glamorous, this winter life, but to settlers, it was the pause their bones demanded. The north wind was a librarian, and winter the quiet reading room. Even language took on a slower tempo. Gone were the shouts tossed over the hum of summer saws or the jangle of cowbells. Conversations were conducted in murmurs, not because anyone was trying to be romantic, but because every breath of cold air felt like swallowing a pine. So they spoke, gently, They whispered recipes, repeated weather proverbs, and occasionally wondered aloud whether geese had opinions. And winter dinners, hearty, steaming, deeply beige, became high art. A stew back then wasn't just food. It was every potato, onion, and questionable turnip they'd remembered to bury beneath the floor in November. Heavy iron pots blipped and burbled for hours, the ingredients mingling like quiet old friends who'd stopped keeping score. Bread, dense enough to use as a doorstop, sat next to bowls of preserved apples that had been dried into something poetic and nearly chewable. Outside, if you listened long enough, you might hear the snow whispering down from branches or the faint scamper of a brave mouse whose ambitions outpaced his insulation strategy. But mostly, the world exhaled. Winter wasn't just a season. It was the settlers' shared lullaby, a weary sigh after a long chapter of cutting, stacking, carrying, and planting. And as those firelit cabins stirred one last time before sleep, someone always remembered to bank the fire. A few coals tucked close under ash to keep the sweet embers alive till morning. Up ahead, in the deep blue hours, the night stretched on, quietly waiting for the next pot of stew and the next old tale retold. As the moon glazed the frozen fields in hues of silver and sheep's wool grey, the settlers tucked under their quilts and flannel layers with a slow-motion kind of purpose, the way someone closes a book, not because they're finished, but because the fire is low and bed is inevitable. The long winter night was once again their companion, a quiet tapestry stitched with creaks from the timber walls and the occasional sleepy grunt from the cow in the barn, who had most definitely settled in with ambitions of profound and uninterrupted ruminations. But inside those rough-hewn homes, something a little unexpected blossomed in those hushed hours. Music, or rather, the slow birth and mild bickering that often precedes it. You see, early home entertainment ran exclusively on muscle and memory. Long before earbuds and algorithm-curated playlists, the average settler's Spotify was named Aunt Hester, and she had an impressive but oddly limited catalogue of fiddle tunes and 13-verse ballads that may or may not have ended with someone drowning in a bog. Children, stiff with boredom and mildly oatmeal stuffed, would gather near the hearth, where cracked fiddle strings were tightened with the patience of saints and a touch of New England profanity. And when the music began, scraped gently from wood and string like a sound your dreams might hum to themselves. It wasn't polished. It wasn't supposed to be. It was a little funny, charming, like the musical equivalent of a dog in boots. There's a curious warmth to the idea that many early settlers didn't play their instruments so much as they talked with them. A battered dulcimer tucked beneath a cot might be brought out, not because there was a birthday or a holiday, but because the wind had howled at the wrong moment, or the soup had scorched a bit, and someone needed to remind everyone they were still human. And as these notes filled the room, awed, occasionally off-key, something else happened too. Stories came to life. It would typically begin with a tune known from back east, as if geography could be strummed back into the room like a lost cat. Then, someone would interrupt, as was custom, to explain how they once heard that same tune played in a tavern in Boston. Except there was a guy in the corner with too many buttons on his coat, and someone lost a thumb. Laughter would follow. Not the jolting kind, the kind that scares your tea into splashing. No, this was that quiet, wheezy laugh that only old wooden chairs and overcooked toes on the hearth can inspire. One of the great unspoken traditions of winter life was the art of stretching a story. This was not lying, dear listener. Heavens no. It was simply a gentle form of agricultural exaggeration, grown carefully across years and family gatherings, fertilized generously by forgetfulness and hot cider. Grandfather had once faced down a bear with a soup ladle. That was the tale, anyway. Some detailed changes were expected. In the original version, the bear had just stared at him. In later tellings, there was growling, maybe a scratched sleeve involved. By the time it made its rounds to the children's ears during a particularly snowy November night, the ladle had magical properties, and grandfather had spoken fluent bear. And wasn't that part of what held them together through such quiet? Not just the survival, though that was no small feat, but the absurd, brilliant way humans insist on being interesting to one another, even when no one else is watching. There are few universal truths in this world, but one may very well be this. If you give a small group of people a long enough winter, they will eventually form a band, name it after something regrettable, and invent a holiday around it. Somewhere outside, in the haloed blackness of the snow-covered night, a fox slinked past, unimpressed by humanity's knack for musical midwifery. But inside, the room felt layered with something ancient and gentle, like a worn quilt filled with notes and giggles and the bones of once tall tales. The wind pressed again at the chimney, this time a little softer, as if even it had paused to listen. And as the fire crackled and the final notes of a well-loved fiddle tune dissolved into the hush, minds began to wander toward dreams, toward warmth, and toward a quiet curiosity about what else the longest nights might coax from the heart. Tomorrow would bring something else entirely, something stitched. When the firewood stack began to resemble a chess match between pine and birch, the settlers knew they were entering the season of truly creative silence. Not the theatrical kind where someone sighs dramatically before revealing a secret, but the muffled hush that only occurs when snow has claimed the world outside and even the birds seem to be whispering. By January, snowdrifts leaned stubbornly against cabin walls like sleepy bears trying to eavesdrop. Windows were glazed with icy lace, nature's attempt at decor, with the occasional pattern that looked suspiciously like a stern Puritan minister or an owl in mid-blink. In these frost-covered homes, the world moved in slow motion. A spoon stirring porridge was an event. A sneeze echoed like a scandal. And so, the early settlers, wrapped in layers of wool and reason, turned inward, not just into their homes, but into themselves. With the world frozen stiff outside, storytelling became their central hearth. Warming minds when actual heat was limited to a fireplace doing its best impression of the sun, with a hickory smile. Over in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, one particularly long night gave rise to what might be the earliest lukewarm practical joke in colonial history. A young man named Obadiah, an apprentice flax weaver with questionable timing, tried to convince his neighbors that he could see ghost rabbits hopping across the frozen fields at twilight. This, he claimed, explained the mysterious disappearing rutabagas from his larder. Never mind that the rutabagas had vanished long before winter, or that ghost rabbits, as a concept, lacked both plausibility and nutritional habits. Still, Obadiah enjoyed 3 full nights of attention before Mrs. Tilly Sherborne caught him gnawing suspiciously on the last of his own pickled root vegetables. Such mischief was rare, though. Mostly, the season favoured quieter amusements. The slow carving of wooden utensils, the braiding of corn-husk dolls, and cautious attempts at singing that often trailed off into embarrassed humming. Music was appreciated, but not always practiced. Stringing together a melody in a cabin the size of a large closet while your entire extended family was within arm's reach, tended to amplify both errors and egos. Literacy, however, flourished on cold nights. By firelight, settlers read aloud to one another, psalms, sermons, and the occasional medical guide that recommended nutmeg for everything from hysteria to howling fits. The margins of old colonial Bibles often bore doodles of comically fat squirrels, unintentionally cross-eyed livestock, and more than one rendition of a very bored St. Paul. These marginalia told their own cozy stories, snapshots of the soul in the long hush between December and thaw. Meanwhile, time was kept not by clocks, which were as rare as patience in January, but by the creak of the house and the yawns of the matriarch. If someone yawned more than 3 times in a conversation, it was generally agreed that the day had ended. Meal prep slowed as supplies dwindled. By now, the last fresh turnip had been serenaded farewell. Foods became more imaginative. Snowwater soup, bark-infused tea, and the deeply unpopular gruel 3 ways. But with limitation came invention. One settler family became legendary for discovering that, when properly frozen and then fried over cast iron, porridge could be coaxed into something almost resembling a crunchy toast. They named it frost loaf. The innovation never spread, possibly because no one else wanted to eat breakfast with a chisel. Night in these wintry homes arrived like a guest who didn't knock. Candles burned low, shadows leaned in. Beds were shared not only out of necessity but for warmth. A communal arrangement that led to an extraordinary knowledge of one's relatives' snoring rhythms. There was always that one uncle who whistled through his nose like a forgotten kettle. But what the season lacked in activity, it offered in serenity. There was a peace in being so far removed from noise, from ambition, from anything sharper than a knitting needle. This was hibernation as heritage, drowsy and enduring. The very air had a soundless, ancient patience to it, as though it too was content to wait a little longer for spring. And as another long evening drew itself across the grainy sky like a woolen shawl, the silence began to settle once more, even softer than before. Outside, snowfall resumed its delicate erasure of footprints, covering every trace, every path, every print with velvet stillness. The only thing that remained to move was the firelight, dancing slowly across the cabin walls as another story waited patiently for just the right moment to wander in, despite their flint-eyed stoicism and a wardrobe dictated mostly by what could survive repeated patching. Early settlers had one indulgence they rarely did without during long winters: the art of prolonged complaining by firelight. This wasn't the whiny sort of griping we might associate with modern inconveniences. There were no rants about weak Wi-Fi or kale, shortages, but rather a kind of ritual theatrical lamentation, offered like folk music to soothe the soul through blistering snowdrifts. Picture it. It's the depth of January. The kind of frost that makes your eyelashes freeze together has set in. Outside, the world has gone quiet, buried beneath snow as thick as unshaken memory. Inside, we find a huddle of humans in a one-room cabin that smells faintly of smoke, boiled shoes, and damp wool. One settler clears his throat, leans back on a rickety stool beside the hearth, and says, half to the fire and half to the rafters, "This here's the coldest one yet." Another, holding a mug so warm it may as well be the sun itself in liquid form, nods solemnly and tops him. "Aye, makes last December feel like Upper Egypt." Someone's great uncle mutters that the cold in 1799 could kill a man's pride right out of his chest, but no one corrects him, mostly because no one is entirely sure what year it is anymore. These complaint sessions were a kind of oral history, composed on the spot and in woolen long johns, a mixture of competition and communion, and deeply therapeutic for a people whose primary alternative form of entertainment was staring at the wall and hoping it turned into something interesting. Outside, the snowflakes drifted downward with a gentleness that belied their effect. Back then, snowfall wasn't just precipitation. It was an announcement. A white curtain falling across the stage of daily life. Roads disappeared like a magician's assistant. Trees stood frozen in postures of philosophical contemplation. And most dramatically of all, work halted. There is a distinct silence known only to snow. Early settlers knew it well. A silence so deep, even the crows gave up commentary. And within that hush, a curious thing happened. Time softened. Days stretched long and slow, stitched together only by chores and the occasional wildly optimistic attempt at bread. With the outer world blanketed and boundaries disappeared beneath white drifts, winter became a great equalizer. Everyone was equally cold, equally hungry, and equally at the mercy of an indoor lifestyle dictated almost entirely by candle hours and woodpile anxiety. That anxiety was no small thing. The woodpile took on almost mythological importance in households, especially come February, which many settlers darkly referred to as wood regret season. That's when all the logs you were supposed to split, but didn't, all the extra supplies you meant to gather but gambled against, they came back with a vengeance, or, at the very least, with absolutely no warmth whatsoever. In this way, wood became the currency of both survival and marital tension. One colonial journal entry, written in a hand so jagged it suggests mitten wearing amid frostbite, reads, "The days are quiet. My wife has begun assigning personalities to logs. She prefers the wide birch for its cheerfulness. I suspect early madness. But who am I to say? As I spent an hour conversing with a broom handle last eve. And yet, within this tight cabin life, there was also a peculiar comfort. Neighbors became stories passed over fences of snow. Cats became hot water bottles with opinions. Children swaddled in layers of sweaters until they resembled walking fabric rolls, learned elaborate, slightly ridiculous games involving beans and wishful thinking. And the food, oh the food, was the stuff of quiet miracles. A stew actively boiling on the hearth for 6 consecutive hours became a kind of communal legend. Nobody knew or admitted what precisely was in it, only that it was hot, somewhat salty, and crucially, not snow. And so, by firelight and flickering shadow, another evening would pass. Each creak of the wind outside reaffirmed the thickness of the walls, the sturdiness of the beams, and the importance of shared body heat. There was a sense, sitting there in the amber warmth, that while the world outside may have stopped, frozen, time kept moving quietly indoors, a hearth-fired heartbeat in the long, slumbering winter. Tomorrow, perhaps, they'd risk checking the barn. But tonight, well, tonight the beans were warm, the wind wasn't howling directly down the chimney, and someone had a new theory about whether cows could dream. And that, naturally, is a tale for another firelit evening. There are few things more humbling than the realization that your survival may hinge on whether your neighbor likes your bread. Not the flavor, mind you. We're talking about barter value. In the deep lull of a colonial winter, when the snow jammed doorways shut and the creek turned so solid even the fish stopped trying, bread became a sort of frosted currency. Ovens were few, yeast was temperamental, and wheat was only slightly more rare than mermaids. In the huddled hamlets of the northern colonies, Folks passed the frozen months swapping what little they had for what they hoped might taste different. A jar of pickled turnips could get you an afternoon's worth of firewood. A knitted sock, just one, mind you, might fetch half a pound of dried apples. And if you were the proud owner of a whole cured ham, you were essentially a minor monarch. But nothing spoke of quiet winter economy quite like the scent of bread rising by the hearth. In cabins thick with smoke and dreams of spring, someone was always conducting a brave little experiment with sourdough starter, a bubbling, unpredictable potion that often behaved more like a pet than a pantry item. Settlers gave their starters names, fed them more loyally than some remembered to feed their chickens, and praised them on their personalities. He's a lively lad today, one might say of a particularly bubbly dough. Must be the rhubarb vinegar I gave him last Wednesday. Of course, it wasn't all soft crusts and homey smells. Winter bread baking was a science tangled awkwardly inside a guessing game. There were no thermostats, only gut instinct and the colour of the fire. You wanted the coals to glow like dragon's breath, not too angry, not too sleepy, before sliding your dough into the brick oven, or, more often, a cast-iron Dutch oven buried beside the embers. Too hot and your bread blackened like burnt boots. Too cool and you'd get what was known colloquially as weepy dough. Any resemblance to edible food purely coincidental. The results were uneven, lopsided, but nearly always treasured. Even a collapsed loaf could be toasted into passable trenchers or crumbled into pottage. And let's not imagine that early settlers wouldn't eat stale bread with enthusiasm. They'd eat it with butter if they had it, or dreams of butter if they didn't. In truth, the communal bread exchanges in the winter months created one of the earliest examples of food-based diplomacy. The widow Mayfield, a formidable woman who could swing an axe with ferocious elegance, made a rye loaf laced with dill that became the talk of the snowbelt. One strategically offered slice at the town meeting earned her the support she needed to acquire her late husband's woodlot. And somewhere around 1740, in a lonely New Hampshire outpost, a particularly inventive young man, name now forgotten but surely worthy of a plaque, began using a flat stone warmed in the coals as a makeshift griddle. He called the results snow cakes, which were essentially tough little pancakes that required more chewing than thinking, but had the heartwarming benefit of holding jam tolerably well. Years later, some say that recipe wandered off and eventually evolved into modern-day flapjacks. The pancakes, sadly, retained none of their original name's poetic frostiness. By the midwinter point, every root cellar had developed its own identity and scent. There's a certain art to storing carrots in sand, turnips in sawdust, and cabbages in quiet shame. When people grew frustrated with their winter baking and unsure of their trading potential, they often returned to these dim cellars, stared meaningfully at withering potatoes, and reconsidered their opinions about boiled everything. But eventually, the baking continued. After all, bread wasn't just nourishment. It was a way to pass the silence, a mild ceremony in a long, unending hush. Settlers sat side by side on benches dusted with flour and spoke about nothing in particular while dough turned and rose beneath wool blankets like a curious animal waiting to be born. And while no one said it aloud, everyone knew that it was in these quiet acts, the kneading, the watching, the scent of crusts just caught, that the soul found its kindling. Outside, the snow stacked higher than the windowsills. Inside, the only storm was the occasional flour cloud, and perhaps the faint tension over who forgot to stoke the fire last. Beyond the hearth, in the dark hush of the forest, where trees slept taller each night, the Last frozen echoes of December waited, whispering the promise of lengthening days and different leftovers to come. By the last stretch of winter, when the wind had lost its novelty and mittens had holes drilled in them by sheer repetition, the early settlers found themselves face to face with their most cunning adversary, time. Snow had blanketed the landscape in such thick, mood-dampening layers that sound itself seemed to give up and curl into a corner. Even the foxes and crows grew quiet. Outside, the world was hushed under a quilt of snowflakes so thick that even the most extroverted of squirrels second-guessed their social calendar. Inside, however, was a different sort of frozen frontier. Picture, if you will, a log cabin about the size of a modern elevator lobby, shared by one family, 2 goats who apparently didn't get the barn memo, and occasionally a neighbor named Elias, who claimed to come by just to borrow salt, but mysteriously always stayed until stew. Among the settlers, timekeeping had taken on a new personality. Clocks were rare, and if you had one, odds were good. It had frozen solid in early January, and nobody trusted it anymore. Instead, days were measured by events like the day the pickles unthawed and then refroze, or the morning Sarah mistook a frozen boot for a loaf of bread. In a silence so still that tea steam became a source of dramatic entertainment, creativity became necessity. Some families played games like Guess What's in the Pot Tonight, which was more thrilling than it sounds, when your culinary ingredients included things like dried turnip skin and something mysteriously referred to in journals as salted not beef. Others passed the hours telling stories, tall tales. One elderly matriarch famously convinced 3 generations that she'd wrestled a bear outside the smokehouse one winter, armed only with a ladle and an unshakable sense of personal space. But behind the humor and the hopeful, foolishness was grit, a quiet sort, like powdered snow. Courage during these stretches wasn't the kind that shouted or charged the hilltops. It was the kind that mended socks again and again, that chopped ice off the well each morning and didn't complain when the axe handle offered a splinter to go along with your frostbite. There was, of course, a peculiar settler pastime that emerged during these long, inert evenings. The art of making lists of things you would never do again once spring came. These included, but were not limited to, sharing your only pillow with a goat, melting snow with your breath because the kettle was already in use, and wearing all your trousers at once to bed, and somehow still not being warm. In towns and outposts where solitude reigned, whispering to the sourdough starter became its own social circle. The starter, renamed things like Myrtle or Carl, was fed and sung to like royalty. Bread wasn't just sustenance, it was a relationship. Thankfully, Myrtle never talked back, though some claim she sulked when bread didn't rise. And then there were the journals. Oh, the glorious rambling journals. Pages and pages written by candlelight, where spelling was optional and punctuation was frankly discouraged. In one such entry dated a February 12th of suspicious temperature, a young man confessed to falling in love with the moon, not in a poetic sense, but alarmingly literal. He claimed it winked at him, and that was all it took. Solitude, ladies and gentlemen, it has an orbit. Yet amid all these strange, splendid behaviors, something remarkable happened each winter. The forging of patience, a virtue no one really asks for, but one that arrives bundled in frosted silence, like uninvited mail from destiny. Neighbors became confidants, not out of preference, but proximity. Children learned to whittle soap, not because it was especially riveting, but because there was no such thing as TikTok to save them. The smell of pine smoke in one's hair became socially acceptable perfume. And all of it, every moment of boredom, awkwardness, and icy resourcefulness, was part of the settlement rite of passage. It was in late February, typically, when the snow began to change tone. It clung to trees with a certain reluctance. Water dripped from eaves in tentative, hopeful beats. A sort of thawed curiosity moved through the settlements, like someone had cracked open the sky just enough to let the smell of mud return. Earth's way of whispering, almost there, which is where we leave them now, our winter-found settlers, wrapped in wool, pride, exhaustion, and hope, staring out frosted windows for the first hint of the melt. And in that quiet, just before the thaw, something else begins. A sound, faint but unmistakable. The drip, drip, drip of a season turning. Let's follow that slow sound into what comes next, as another long winter night curled itself tightly around the cabin like a lumbering black bear in hibernation. The early settlers prepared for bed. Not that one slept so much as congealed into a semi-conscious state, swaddled in quilts, furs, and the questionable comfort of thermal fortitude. Winds outside howled like unpaid musicians, screaming through the chinks in the log walls. But within, everything had settled into a kind of low, flickering peace. By this point in the season, they had adapted to the silence, the deep, insulating kind that snow brings. It was the quiet not of absence, but of abundance. The kind of hush that filled your ears with its own sound. A telegraph service for the profoundly still. It made you a bit philosophical, if only because your brain had finally slowed down to ambient goat-herding pace. Supper had been stew again, a liberal interpretation involving root vegetables, the last leathery bit of last year's jerky, and an herb the children swore was a weed, but which the matron of the house insisted gave it spirit. That night, the stew had spirit with a vengeance. Whether culinary or mystical remained a matter of some intestinal debate. As the fire popped its final toasty rhythms and the candle nubs gave up their smoky ghosts, the cabin retreated into darkness. This was a ritual. Each evening, the settlers handed their worries to the night, which handled them like an overburdened postal clerk, slow, silent, and likely to lose at least one or two. The children drifted off first, eased by the rhythm of the wind and the dull, hypnotic scratch of their father whittling something entirely impractical. A spoon shaped like a duck, or perhaps a duck shaped like a spoon. No one knew, not even him. He whittled not out of purpose, but as a kind of winter meditation. The longer he carved, the more philosophical he became. "Cold's a kind of coat, if you make peace with it," he murmured once, producing no useful response from the household other than a muffled snore and the gentle shifting of cats. Speaking of cats, even they grew dignified in winter. Story goes that a creature doesn't truly earn its place on the hearth until it has mastered the art of heat theft, lying supine in the perfect spot in front of the fire until everyone resents it in total, chilly silence. By now, the cats had achieved legendary status, ranking somewhere above the youngest child and just below the family Bible, which mostly served as a stand for the lantern. Outside, the snow had started up again, the kind that fell like secrets, each flake a whisper caught mid-thought. You could almost hear it if you pressed your ear to the frost-laced window pane, the soft mondegreen of Mother Nature mumbling in cursive. The fields, what could be seen of them from the slits between shutters, lay in a white shroud. The bare trees reached toward nothing, their branches permanently frozen in postures of indecision. The world was not asleep. It was holding its breath, tiptoeing through its own dream. And in the very center of all, this frozen wonder, wrapped head to toe in wool and generations of practical stubbornness, lay an old woman. She was the sort of eternal figure who seemed to exist at all times in a state of quiet humming. Her bed creaked with the weight of unseen stories and rose every so slightly, not from supernatural means, but by the sheer dignity with which she lay in it. She had known winters thicker than this, ones where fire was luxury and soup was hope. To her, these long nights were not something to be survived, but to be appreciated. She regarded sleep as a pilgrimage, each night a slow voyage into inner terrain where time sat beside you and passed you a mug of something vaguely medicinal. As the final candle flickered, then bowed out like a performer overcome with humility, the cabin became one with the darkness. And in that darkness, there was peace. Not glitzy, showy peace, but homely, lopsided peace. The kind you earn through months of chopping wood, reusing tea leaves, and arguing whether or not God intended potatoes to sprout. Outside, the wind softened. Snow continued its silent descent, covering the land and all its complications in a muffled promise that nothing, not even winter, lasts forever. And in the stillness of these pale hours, with heart slow and eyes heavy, the settlers slept, just as you are meant to now. Dream, gentle listener, as the long winter night hushes even history. Let the snow mute the clocks, and the past become a fireside murmur. You've earned your silence. Good night.